Welcome back to our channel. Today's video is a great one. We're going to take a look at the top 10 artists of TSR in the golden age of Dungeons & Dragons. In today's video, we're going to enjoy the art and the artist of the early days of TSR's flagship product, Dungeons & Dragons. Think about the art that you remember from the first few times you opened those books and played the game. Is there a particular artist whose work always takes you back to that time? We'll probably talk about that person and their work today. We're going to count down the top 10 artists of TSR for the period 1974 to 1981. We'll throw in a few honorable mentions at the end as well. We stop around 1981 because a lot of the early artists are leaving about that time period, and a lot of new artists are coming and joining TSR. So it's really a good place to break down the countdown. We'll talk about some of the artists from the sort of, I call the second generation or second wave of artists in a future video. I'm AZ Mountaineer. This is our channel, Old School Rules, where we celebrate the community of old school gamers and grognards who knew what kobolds were when that wasn't cool. Please stick around and enjoy the video. If there's one thing that players of Dungeons & Dragons everywhere had in common, it was the art that we saw on the covers and in the pages of the products created for TSR's game, Dungeons & Dragons. This video examines the artists whose images brought the words and the world alive for an entire generation of gamers. To be clear, I'm not trying to identify the best artist, nor tell you about who is my personal favorite artist. I'm not qualified to do the former, and I'm not really certain that anyone cares about the latter. My goal here is to identify the artists whose body of work over this time period, 74 to 81, contributed the most to the iconic images we remember from the golden age of D&D. In large part, my conclusions are a combination of volume of work, the place of those images in the common memory, and uniqueness of style. So if everyone remembers and loves an image, for example, the cover of one of the core books, that would push an artist up in the rankings. I probably weigh a bit heavier for the artists that were around closer to the beginning, but certainly the number of well-known images, the size of the artist's D&D catalog, all of those things factor in. But most importantly, let's just enjoy some of the fantastic art that we all know and love. So without further ado, here's my list of the top 10 artists of Dungeons & Dragons Golden Age. Coming in at number 10, Jim Holloway. Jim Holloway arrived at TSR right at the end of this period, and so much of his prolific contribution was provided in the years to come. But even in his earliest work, the unique style and feel was there. Well done and more realistic than some of the earliest art, but at the same time, still very clearly representative. A fantasy illustration, and his work almost always had a little tinge of humor. He did covers for modules, as well as interior illustrations. And no one really knew how to draw a human being who was yelling in quite the same way as Jim's work. It's the kind of thing where when you see a Jim Holloway piece, you know it's him. Coming in at number 9, Russ Nicholson and Alan Hunter. Yes, I know, it's a bit of a cheat to call two people in one number, but I named a duo of artists whose images largely depict the monsters in the Fiend folio. Their unique style created a very different vibe for the first and only hardcover book produced by TSR that was largely based on the work of their UK counterparts at Games Workshop. Just look at these images. If you had the Fiend folio like I did, you looked at the images a lot, and you learned about a lot of interesting new monsters, like the Githyanki, and the Flynn, and the Death Knight. They had some of these huge full-page illustrations as well that were just fascinating. Here's one by Alan Hunter and the other by Russ Nicholson. Most of these monsters, you probably know, came from the pages of Games Workshop's signature magazine, White Dwarf, and then combined into this book. The Kuatoa. This was the first time the drow were in one of the hardback books. The Hook Horror, the Phantom Stalker, on and on. Just fantastic monsters. I think probably not nearly as well used as the monsters that came from the Monster Manual 1 or 2, but I just really love the monsters as well as the art. Our number 8 artist is David LaForce, the man known by his initials DSL, also known by his nickname Diesel. David LaForce was a Lake Geneva native. He was friends with Rob Kuntz and played in some of Gary Gygax's early D&D sessions, as well as those run by Rob. He was hired into the shipping department, but his artistic talent became known to TSR's art director, David Sutherland, who asked him to submit art for the upcoming Dungeon Master's Guide. TSR purchased 2 of his images for the core AD&D book, and soon LaForce had moved from the shipping room to the art department, where he became one of what I like to call the core 4 artists at TSR in the late 70s and early 80s, along with Erol Otus, Jeff D., and Jim Roslof. His art includes several pieces in a booklet of illustrations in the C1 module, Deities and Demigods, and a number of other modules, as well as the new Mold Bay Cook Basic and Expert box sets that come out towards the end of this period. His meticulous approach and interest in cartography also led him to be responsible for a number of the maps that appeared in D&D modules. Number 7, Bill Willingham. Bill joined TSR in 1980, straight out of the Army. He made an immediate impact on the volume of new products being created for TSR. Modules, hardcover books, and the new Moldvay and Cook Basic Expert box sets. His illustrations became some of the most popular images for young players who joined the hobby around that time in the early 80s. His work conveys a sense of energy and action that's dramatic and fantastic. And for a fantasy gamer, his work drew the scenes we all wanted to see in our minds as we adventured through dungeons and adventures. Here we see the inside cover of the Moldvay and Cook Basic and Expert set, as well as some illustrations that were in those books. He drew most of the one-page advertisement comics for D&D that appeared in the Marvel comics during this period. Here are covers from the G123 module, as well as the cover from L1, The Secret of Bone Hill, and some rear covers from adventure modules. Unable to convince TSR to launch its own D&D comic, Willingham eventually left TSR to pursue his passion of drawing comics, and he has enjoyed a successful career in illustration. Also drew some of my favorite images of the Drow, as well as the best Minotaur I've ever seen in any D&D book. The number 6 artist on our list is Darlene. And Darlene would be the number 3 artist on my list if we stopped in 1979 with the publication of the Dungeon Master's Guide. Her art in that book was simply amazing. Every single one of these images is memorable. She continued working for TSR after the Dungeon Master's Guide and produced these iconic World of Greyhawk maps. I think the originals were several feet tall. A lot of us played in this world when we were younger. In addition to that, she did illustrations for the Deities and Demigods book. She did the new front and rear illustrations of the reissued In Search of an Unknown Adventure, and some interior art in module C1. Now we move into the top 5 with Jeff D. Starting as a freelancer in the late 70s, Jeff quickly began producing artwork that filled the pages and the covers of D&D modules, as well as a number of popular pantheons in the Deities and Demigods book. His unique, clean style was more reminiscent of comic art than some of the earlier illustration styles prevalent in the OD&D and core AD&D rulebooks. And his arrival signaled a progression in the style and professional focus of TSR's art department. Here we see some images from the basic expert rulebooks, including the incomparable Morgan Ironwolf. In Deities and Demigods, he illustrated part of the Norse mythology, the Egyptian mythology, Melnibonian, Indian, and of course, our Lullerstone. He did some of the iconic covers, including the reissued S1 and X1, which came in the Expert box set, as well as several others. Jeff D. was a game designer in his own right and had already illustrated and designed a hero-based RPG called Villains and Vigilantes before he joined TSR. He produced covers for some of the most well-known modules, including, as I mentioned, S1 and T1, X1, S1, A1, and A3. His interior illustrations were equally memorable. And as I mentioned, I consider him one of the core 4 whose art really filled the pages of the volume of products that were being put out by TSR towards the late 70s and early 80s. The number 4 artist on my list is Jim Rosloff. Not only did his art grace the cover of the most widely distributed D&D module of all time, B2, The Keep on the Borderlands, he also contributed memorable art in hardcover books and modules throughout this time period. Here's some of his artwork from the Deities and Demigods. He did the Greek pantheon, as well as parts of other pantheons, with a number of very memorable illustrations from that book. His full-page art picture of Thor battling during Ragnarok is really one of the best pieces of art in the entire book, which is saying something because the book is full of great art. In addition to B2, Jim's art was on the cover of the A2 module, as well as updated versions of C2 and the D1-2. Even though B2 is probably his most famous artwork, I think perhaps the D1-2 cover he did might be the most amazing module cover from the entire period. He also played an important role in the evolution at TSR. He served as art director in the 80s, and he was responsible for hiring a number of artists who would define the new look of TSR's product in the decade to come. More on that in another video. We're down to the final 3. I'm sure you know who they are. Let's take a look at the order. Perhaps no artist's work is more instantly recognizable than the incomparable Erol Otus. While he only worked at TSR from 1979 to 81, he produced enough art to leave an indelible mark on their products. Otus's art graced the cover of Mulvey, Basic, and the Cook Expert rulebook and box sets that came out, as well as a number of interior illustrations for those volumes. He provided the cover for Deities and Demigods, as well as the Cthulhu, Pantheon, and other illustrations. He provided cover art for a number of modules, beginning with the very old and collectible tournament modules, as well as some of the earlier and most favored adventures that TSR ever produced. He produced cover art for a number of accessories and for the Dungeon Master screen. In all, he produced cover and interior art that was part of more than 20 modules during this period. And certainly, as I said before, when you see an Erol Otus drawing or painting, you don't even really need to look for the signature to know it came from his hand. Coming in at number 2 is David Trampier. Perhaps no image is more singularly recognized or called to mind when someone thinks of art from the golden era of D&D than Trampier's cover to the Player's Handbook. One of the most beloved artists by many old school gamers, Trampier's mark was significant, even though his tenure was all too brief. His memorable Player's Handbook cover, as well as illustrations in the Monster Manual, were the kind of images you went back and looked at over and over again. The illustration at the end of that book, the players finding the treasure, is another of those images that all of us will look at and remember years later. In addition to the cover to the Player's Handbook and the other illustrations, he did interior illustrations in the Player's Handbook, in the Dungeon Master's Guide, worked on the DM, did an art piece for the DM screen, the basic D&D rule books, and even a clever cartoon called Wormy that appeared in Dragon magazine. In addition to this, he also did the cover for TSR's Gamma World game at this time. Trampier's sudden disappearance in the late 80s, for reasons no one has really understood, resulted in a fate that was unknown for over 15 years. He largely missed the explosion in D&D popularity, and with it, his status as one of the most well-known and beloved artists of this golden age. Here we see his cover to G2, an interior illustration from G3, as well as his cover from the original version of T1, The Village of Alma. In addition, he had several classic illustrations that appeared in modules, perhaps none more recognizable than the face from S1, The Tomb of Horrors. And that brings us to the number 1 artist on our list, David Sutherland. No one person is responsible for more of the imagery from the first generation of TSR products than David Sutherland. Not only was his tenure at TSR longer than perhaps anyone else, his contribution is stamped across the products from OD&D to Holmes, Advanced D&D, Mold Bay, and Cook, as well as all the supporting products for those various iterations of the game. Here's the first Demogorgon, the first Umber Hulk, Pig-Faced Orcs, the cover to the Holmes box set, not only did he do the cover to the Monster Manual, but over 150 interior illustrations as well. These images from the Monster Manual define for a generation of gamers exactly what so many of these iconic, fantastic creatures looked like. Without these illustrations, how would you ever really understand what a rust monster, a Zorn, or an owlbear looked like? He provided cover and interior art for rulebooks, modules, and accessories. Here's his famous one from the Player's Handbook called A Paladin in Hell, as well as a number of other illustrations that I remember looking at time and time again. He also provided the cover to the Dungeon Master's Guide. Provided the covers for a number of the early version of TSR's adventure modules and interior illustrations. In addition to his personal contribution of art, he also is responsible for guiding the growth of the art department at TSR, and frankly is responsible for the TSR careers of nearly all the other artists on this list. So there you have our top 10 artists of TSR during Dungeons & Dragons Golden Age. And now for a few artists who didn't make the list, our honorable mentions. There are a number of other artists who contributed to the art and imagery of Dungeons & Dragons in the early years. Tom Wham provided a number of illustrations we all know and remember. His Beholder is extremely, I think, recognizable, as well as his rather humorous view of art on some of his other illustrations. Greg Bell is responsible for the original art for Dungeons & Dragons. He provided the cover of the original wood grain box set, as well as a couple of the supplements. He created the Lizard Man logo that frankly I think was the best logo that the company ever had, and a number of illustrations in those early volumes. Greg only makes honorable mention rather than the top 10 list because of some of the controversy around the art, which was largely borrowed from art that he had taken in Marvel comic books and utilized with some slight changes to switch from the Marvel comic character to fantastic setting. Stephen Sutherland is another artist not quite as well known, but who did a number of illustrations in this period. Of particular interest, Stephen Sullivan did a number of the illustrations in the famous B3 orange version that was largely destroyed, as well as a lot of the mapping from those early era modules, including, as you see here, the Forbidden City. Emmanuel only garners an honorable mention for his cover of the Fiend Folio, frankly because of the lack of volume in his art. This cover I thought was fantastic, but compared to the other people on the list, just didn't contribute enough art over time to stack up to the top 10. Finally, Harry Quinn. And Harry did some great art. He really comes in at the very end of this time period, continued to do a number of things after sort of my cutoff point, and that probably is another reason he doesn't make it into the top 10, but I think his art is a different style and certainly merits an honorable mention here in our list. That concludes our countdown of the top 10 artists of TSR from the golden era of Dungeons & Dragons, 1974 to 1981. We hope you enjoyed the video, but more than that, I hope you enjoyed the fantastic art that these artists shared with us through the years, and this brought back a lot of great memories. Subscribe if you'd like to keep up with our content, give us a like, but most of all, in the comments down below, please give me your top 10 list. I'd love to read it. That's it for today. Until next time, keep rolling 20s.